That interconnectedness between third party and supply chain risk management and cyber risk management was made so much more explicit, so much more clear, was really highlighted in the Russia Ukraine war because you saw people, for instance, recognizing, oh my gosh, I've got vendors that are owned 1 to 2 degrees away by a Russian oligarch. That Russian oligarch might be using the fact that we use their software 1 to 2 degrees away as an entry point to steal classified information about what the US government is doing in critical infrastructure, let's say. So the nature of cybersecurity and its interconnectedness with third party and supplier risk management, I think was again another revelation that came out of this crisis and this conflict.
Welcome to one of the most important podcast series I've ever been associated with. Never the Same: Business After the Ukraine War. In this 5-part podcast series, along with my co-host Brandon Daniels, we explore how currents which have been percolating since at least the onset of the pandemic in 2020 came to fruition in February of 2022 when Russia invaded. In the 5 topics of supply chain, sanctions and AML, corruption as a national security issue, cybersecurity, and ESG, we will explore how businesses have changed literally forever with the advent of the conflict in Ukraine. These strains did not come out of nowhere. They have been in business bubbling up over the past 2 to 3 years, perhaps even longer. But now, compliance officers, business executives, legal eagles, and the government needs to understand that business has changed forever. And we're going to explore that in this podcast series. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with Brandon Daniels, CEO at Exiger, Inc., for our continued exploration on how the business world has changed forever. First of all, Brandon, welcome back.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. It's good to be back.
Brandon, now let me turn to cybersecurity. And certainly this was an issue, and it's an issue Exiger was very concerned with for years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I would say one of the changes is U.S. companies now see cybersecurity not as a business threat that might curtail operations and cause a ransomware payment to be made, to actually a national security issue that you and the others in the government have been talking about for some time. If that assessment's fair, or do you see cybersecurity changing differently after the Russian invasion?
That's a great question, Tom. The nature of cybersecurity was made explicit by the Russia-Ukraine war. The United States is subject to non-kinetic warfare all the time. And I hate to say it, but Russia and China are essentially showering us. In a lot of cases, state actors are showering us with attacks and attempted and successful acts of IP theft. And so what the Russian invasion of Ukraine highlighted for us and for our customers was that this non-kinetic warfare is happening all the time, and it's going to heat up when the US and Russia are on polar opposites of a geopolitical debate, right? And really the geopolitical debate here is, the sort of survival and the viability of democracy as opposed to autocracies. That's the existential crisis that we're all in. Now, I would bet on democracy every day of the week. And I think the rest of us that love this country would as well. But cybersecurity as another battlefront was just made more explicit by the Russia-Ukraine war and by Russia's attempts to compromise U.S. facilities, U.S. companies, and U.S. technology during this crisis. So The first thing is really that I think it just gave everyone else an understanding of how serious cybersecurity really was from a defense perspective and not just from sort of a corporate risk management perspective. The second point on cybersecurity that really came to light for me was how interconnected it is to commerce. So, what we realized, and I think what we've been preaching for a while at Exiger, but I think the market really had an awakening moment, sort of recognizing was the nature of some of our near peer adversaries and how they use business as a way to further the ambitions of the state. If you look at the supply chain attacks over the last 20 years, or even the last 10 years, Tom, the largest supply chain attacks or the largest cyber attacks that have occurred, 80% of them have been supply chain attacks. So they have been due to software that you had integrated into your organization as a vendor, as a clean vendor, as a clean piece of software. But somewhere earlier in that software development, in that vendor's purchasing of underlying software capabilities, there was a malicious piece of software that was planted by a state owned actor or criminal network that was associated with a near peer adversary. And that interconnectedness between third party and supply chain risk management and cyber risk management was made so much more explicit, so much more clear, was really highlighted in the Russia Ukraine war because you saw people, for instance, recognizing, oh my gosh, I've got vendors that are owned 1 to 2 degrees away by a Russian oligarch. That Russian oligarch might be using the fact that we use their software 1 to 2 degrees away as an entry point to steal classified information about what the US government is doing in critical infrastructure, let's say. So the nature of cybersecurity and its interconnectedness with third party and supplier risk management, I think was again another revelation that came out of this crisis and this conflict.
Brendan, we've talked about specifically supply chain in this podcast series. We've talked about trade sanctions, economic sanctions, and export control. Anti-corruption is a national security issue, crypto and cyber. And one of the themes that I'm hearing throughout this is that although we have talked about these risks in a different podcast, they are not siloed. And in fact, they're almost all interconnected. And just on your last remarks, you talked about cybersecurity, you talked about supply chain, you talked about crypto, and I heard sanctions as well. How would you counsel perhaps a client to help them understand not only the interrelated nature of these risks, but a very holistic risk management approach, starting with the board of directors and senior management to manage these risks going forward?
So the one thing is, it's easy to get overwhelmed. I know there's a lot of complexity here. When we deal with most companies, the biggest issue is, where do we get started? You've got these foreign ownership, control, and influence issues. We've got ESG issues like environmental risks, carbon emissions, companies that have contributed to Superfund sites. You've got social issues like modern slavery or sort of situations where labor strikes can create supply chain disruptions, right? I mean, this kind of panoply and complexity of risk is really hard to fathom, and it's even harder to manage and mitigate. And so, what we counsel our clients to do is to take it in a format that is much easier to manage. What I mean by that is look at it in three sort of distinct areas of control. One is, what risks do your vendors inherently have? We've built software, processes, and expertise that helps clients to assess each vendor that's in their environment for operational risk, foreign ownership, control, and influence, financial health, and reputational, criminal, and regulatory risk, right? We basically allow them to assess every vendor on an individual and singular basis. And we allow them to do that on tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of vendors, depending on how big they are and how big their scale, their supply chain is. But the first thing is think about vendor risk appetite, right? First. So what things do I want to flag when it comes to each vendor coming through my pipeline, and create an onboarding process that manages to that risk appetite, that risk threshold, and then monitor for the risks that could pull a vendor above that risk threshold. And don't do more than that. Get a risk appetite on those sort of four quadrants: operational risk, regulatory/reputational risk, foreign ownership, control and influence, and financial health, and then determine where you think vendors could fall outside of risk appetite based on those four very key attributes. The second type of risk I look at is industry risks. So what are the major critical industries that I'm relying upon? I'm a cloud hosting company. I'm worried about computing resources. I'm worried about bandwidth or, sort of fiber optic resources. And I'm worried about, let's say, power. Take those industries and just monitor those industries for volatility, for risk, for issues. Don't try to boil the ocean. Just look at your critical industries and see where you might have issues that are coming up that could be problematic. And the last thing is jurisdictional risk. What I traditionally do is I look at where my facilities are. I look at where my top or most critical products are being manufactured. Again, if I'm a cloud hosting company, it might be the microelectronics that I use to power my global computing resources. I look at that industry. I determine where the concentration of manufacturing locations are, and then I monitor, for instance, Taiwan and the South China Sea, and make sure that I'm monitoring those couple of countries that are just so imperative to me, or those couple of jurisdictions, regional jurisdictions that are so imperative to me. Because if I take it in those bite-sized chunks, company, industry, and jurisdiction, and then I monitor for anything that looks crisis-esque, I can at least maintain a reactive posture on upcoming events. And once I've done that, then I can do a whole bunch of maturing and evolution and increasing complexity and efficacy work to continuously improve that program to start to work towards the proactive.
Well, Brandon, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time for this episode. I hope our listeners will join us again tomorrow, where we conclude our podcast series with a look at how the world changed with ESG. This is Tom Fox. Thank you for listening to this episode of Never the Same: Business After the Ukraine War. This podcast was produced by One Stone Creative, and I want to give a shout out to Megan Doherty, Audra Cassano, Darla Field, and the entire team at One Stone Creative. If you are interested in podcasting and need some help, or you want to have a turnkey solution, my suggestion is you would contact One Stone Creative. We're going to link to them in the show notes. On a very personal note, I hope this podcast series will get you to think and be curious and look at all of the issues we have explored in this podcast series. I really believe we have had a true watershed moment, and I think those who don't understand that will be left in the dust of 2022. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening. Never the Same: Business After the Ukraine War is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.